Welcome back to 4547blog.com presents the New Conservative Radio Show. I'm your host, NINJ. Today's episode tackles a topic that generates a lot of heat and very little light. Why Minnesota has the largest Somali population in the United States, and what role U.S. policy actually played in shaping that reality. I'm going to discuss the role of Democratic presidents and the abuse of the temporary protection status while they're in office, and also are Democrats purposefully elevating incompetence like Tim Walz, Biden, and Harris to drain taxpayer money during Democratic presidencies. This is an issue that's often reduced to slogans and accusations. Some say it was engineered by one president, others dismiss any discussion as off-limits. Neither approach is useful to the taxpayers, though. What we're doing today is something different. We're laying out the facts chronologically, numbers, policy decisions, and migration patterns, without conspiracy and without denial. Somali migration to Minnesota didn't start with Barack Obama only. It didn't hinge on a single administration, and it didn't happen by, just a single presidential decree. It unfolded over decades of liberal sympathy, driven by civil war abroad, refugee policy across multiple Democrat presidencies, and predictable patterns of secondary migration here at home. We'll look at when Somali migration began, how refugee resettlement actually works, what the verified numbers say about placements in Minnesota, and why the community grew far beyond initial arrivals. We'll also examine how long-term policy decisions intersect with demographics and policy participation over time. In recent years, Minnesota has become the center of some of the largest public fund fraud cases in the nation, involving federal nutrition programs and nonprofit networks, cases that unfolded under Governor Tampon Tim Walz, none other than Governor Tampon Tim, and his administration. Walz has not yet been charged with a crime, but investigations and court filings show that state agencies received early warnings about irregularities that were not acted on at the time. That failure of oversight has raised serious questions about leadership accountability and how, rapidly expanding government programs were actually monitored. We'll walk through the verified data on Somali resettlement, explain how refugee placement actually happens, clarify what presidencies do and don't control, and examine how Minnesota's experience became a national case study in what happens when Democrat leaders turn their head to fraud en masse. This is a conversation about systems, not, stereotypes, about oversight, not outrage, and about why ignoring uncomfortable facts only guarantees bigger scandals later in the future. If you want slogans, this isn't the show. If you want facts, content, and accountability, you're in the right place. You're listening to the New Conservative Radio Show with NINJ, and here we go. During the Obama administration, the United States admitted approximately 3.1 million legal immigrants and roughly 850,000 refugees between 2009 and 2017, according to the State Department and DHS data. Those refugee admissions, they included people from dozens of countries, but Somalis were making up a notable portion because Somalia remained one of the world's largest running failed states. Between 2009 and 2017, the U.S. resettled about 54,500 Somali refugees nationwide. Of those, roughly 6,300 were initially placed in Minnesota. That number's important because it directly isn't tens of thousands deliberately placed in the state by presidential order. Refugee placement is handled through federal agencies and nonprofit settlement partners, not by direct presidential selection. And this is the thing that these liberals are arguing against us, is that, oh my God, they didn't directly put them into Minnesota. But we'll go through that. So presidents, they do not personally choose where individual refugees are placed, but their decisions strongly influence where refugees end up over time. The president sets the annual refugee cap, which determines which regions and nationalities are prioritized and controls funding and enforcement standards. When admissions are increased, states with existing resettlement infrastructure like Minnesota, they receive more placements because they can absorb volume quickly. Federal funding flows to nonprofit resettlement agencies based on capacity, which expands in high admission years and reinforces established destinations. Presidential emphasis on speed or humiliation, urgency can also reduce practical barriers to placement. Consistent prioritization of Somali refugees kept that population eligible for resettlement year after year after year, and it increased national admissions, also driving secondary migration as refugees legally placed elsewhere in the United States relocated to join family and community in decided final relocation destinations, like Minnesota. While presidents don't assign addresses, they control the levers that shape long-term placement patterns. Minnesota's Somali population today is estimated between 80,000 and 100,000 people, with Minnesota's population, or Minneapolis's population, around 425,000 to 429,000. That population size did not come from one administration or one policy decision. It reflects 3 decades of migration, beginning in the 90s after Somalia's government had collapsed, followed by the secondary migration within the United States of families reunifying, and a high U.S.-born birth rate also. Census data shows that now more than half of Minnesota's Somali population was born in the United States, and the majority of the foreign-born residents are naturalized citizens already. What the Obama administration did change was the scale and tempo of refugee admissions overall. Obama raised the annual refugee ceiling multiple times, peaking at 110,000 refugees per year in 2016. The highest level in U.S. history. By comparison, the U.S. admitted around 27,000 refugees in 2002 under George Bush, and fewer than 12,000 in 2020 under Trump. These higher refugee numbers did not target Minnesota specifically, but they expanded immigration populations nationally, especially in urban areas. Once communities reach a critical mass, political participation increased. That process is organic, not conspiratorial, but it has real political consequences as well, as we're seeing today. Minnesota's 5th congressional district, where Ilhan Omar was elected, is one of the most heavily Democratic districts in the country. In such districts, the Democratic primary determines the outcome. As, immigrant communities become more politically active during and after the Obama years, candidates aligned with those communities and gained influence. That is how Omar won her seat. It was a primary election in a district already dominated by Democratic voters and generational Somalian immigrants. Obama didn't personally place voters in Minnesota like the left likes to say that we're trying to portray. But his administration dramatically expanded immigration and refugee admissions into the United States, which accelerated demographics and political changes that continue to this day. Those changes reshaped voting blocks, party coalitions, and local politics altogether, especially in deep blue urban districts. We all know that ignoring the numbers misses the point. Dismissing concerns as conspiracy completely misses the point. Policy decisions at the federal level compound over time, and their political effects, they often appear years later, like we're seeing right now. That's the reality. And understanding it matters if conservatives want to respond strategically instead of emotionally like liberals. The effect of the Obama-era immigration policies and refugee policies didn't end in 2017. They carried forward, paused briefly, by Trump, and then expanded again under Biden-Harris. We all saw what happened with their immigration policies. After refugee admissions were sharply reduced between 2017 and 2020 when Trump was in office, the Biden administration moved quickly to reverse course. And in 2021, President Biden raised the refugee admissions cap to 62,500 and then increased it again to 125,000 per year for both fiscal years of 2022 and 2023. That ceiling exceeds the highest level set during the Obama years, period. From 2021 to 2024, the United States admitted hundreds of thousands of refugees and humanitarian parolees, including continued admissions from Somalia, and while refugee numbers under Biden, they didn't spike to unprecedented levels in a single year, supposedly, on paper, the pipeline reopened on paper, and resettlement organizations resumed their operations at bigger scales. They were given so much more government funding underneath Biden. But at the same time, the Biden administration expanded humanitarian parole and temporary protected status. The family reunification pathways were, opened up also, all of which indirectly affected Somalian immigration. Somalia has remained eligible for temporary parole status extensions, allowing Somali nationals already in the United States to remain and work legally, often serving as anchors for, extended family immigration through, current lawful channels, supposedly lawful channels. Another key factor under Biden has been secondary migration acceleration. Once refugee admissions resumed nationally, Somali families, they continued relocating internally to states with established communities. Minnesota remains a primary destination because of existing social networks, political representation like Ilhan Omar, and institutional support surrounded by the fraud they're uncovering. This internal movement does not show up as refugees placed in Minnesota and federal statistics, but it has real demographic impact. Between 2021 and 2024, U.S. Census estimates show continued growth in Minnesota's Somali population, driven primarily by U.S.-born children and domestic relocation, not direct overseas placement. This is consistent with patterns seen in other large established refugee communities. What they're trying to say is that, hey, we don't put them directly in Minnesota, so we're not just putting them in Minnesota only, so it's not our fault at all, which is completely wrong, and anybody looking at it from the outside can tell. But, politically, the Biden years reinforced trends that began under Obama. Immigrant advocacy organizations regained federal access and funding. Outreach to immigrant communities increased. Voter registration and civic engagement efforts expanded, particularly in the urban districts where the Somalian people ended up relocating to or finally settled in. These developments, they didn't create new voting blocks overnight, but they definitely strengthened existing ones. The critical point is continually Obama expanded immigration and refugee admissions. Biden restored and then he extended them. The demographic effects compound gradually, while the political effects, they always emerge later, often after the policy decisions fade from the headlines. For us conservatives, this distraction matters. The Somali population in Minnesota is not the result of a single administration, a single policy, or a single election. It's the product of long-term federal decisions repeated across administrations, combined with predictable migration behavior and natural population growth of immigrants led in by the Democratic government and advocated for by the Democratic government. Understanding that sequence, Obama expands, Trump contrasts, Biden re-expands. It provides a clear picture that partisan blame alone, immigration policy operates on a lag. The actual political outcomes, they follow years later. That's the reality conservatives must grapple with if they want to understand how federal policy translates into local political power. There's also another dimension that has to be discussed. Honestly, if policymakers want to prevent repeated failures, it's how certain cultural norms can interact with weak government systems in ways that increase the risk of fraud itself. It's not about race or, religion, it's about a mismatch. The collision between modern Western bureaucracies and cultures shaped by decades of survival in failed states like Somalia. In Somalia, the absence of functioning central government for more than 30 years created an environment where informal networks replaced institutions. War clan-based trust systems, cash economics, and mutual obligation, they became the primary way people survived. Loyalty to family and clan, often mattered more than compliance and distant authorities because there were no reliable authorities at all. Loyalty to clan was everything, and America has moved away from tribalism and clanism for generations now. When individuals from those environments enter large Western, welfare and nonprofit systems in a mass, problems are always going to arise. Not because people are inherently dishonest, but because the system assumes norms that are not universal where they come from. The U.S. programs rely heavily on self-reporting, paper accuracy, and digital compliance. Many fraud cases involve cash transactions, shell vendors, and informal bookkeeping practices common in regions without stable banking where fraud is a common way of life, like Somalia. Clan or family loyalty can encourage collective participation in schemes where government funds are viewed as abstract or unlimited or impersonal because these people could care less about the American taxpayer as a whole. They just want their money. In some cases, documented by prosecutors, individuals justified fraudulent activity not as theft, but redistribution or community benefit or compensation for perceived historical or governmental injustices, just as the Democrats consistently shape the narrative on TV. That mind state doesn't originate in America. It's not a survival adaptation carried over from failed systems where state resources were either predatory or non-existent. This is what Democrats advocate for here at home, to steal your hard-earned tax money. Minnesota's feeding our future case illustrates this clearly, guys. Federal indictments describe coordinated activities among networks and nonprofits and vendors and participants, not lone actors. The fraud succeeded because internal trust networks move faster than government oversight, and because officials hesitated to intervene once accusation carried political sensitivity, so they could be reelected to office, not for the best interest of Americans in Minnesota. This is not unique to, Somali communities either. Similar dynamics have appeared in fraud cases involving other immigrant groups, disaster relief scams, and pandemic aid abuse nationwide. The pattern emerges wherever large sums of money move quickly, oversight is delayed, cultural norms differ from institutional experiences, enforcement is politically constrained, or large numbers of third world immigrants end up in one place, kind of like Minnesota. The problem is not culture alone, though. Culture plus opportunity plus weak enforcement, this is what creates systemic abuse. In short, these people are not doing their jobs. And when leaders refuse to acknowledge that reality, fearing accusations because of bias, they intentionally protect bad actors while harming honest families who follow the rules and depend on these programs legitimately. If they're smart enough to be politicians, they're smart enough to understand the consequences of looking the other way with taxpayer money. The conservative argument here isn't exclusion, it's alignment, guys. If the United States admits refugees from failed states or failed countries, it must also enforce strict financial controls. It must require transparent auditing. It's got to provide clear legal education about fraud and the consequences of if they were to participate that while here in America. They need to act quickly when these red flags appear. They've got to separate compassion from complacency, and they have to deport immediately if these norms or laws are broken to protect the American people as a whole. Ignoring cultural or institutional mismatches does not promote inclusion. It guarantees a scandal in the future. Minnesota learned that lesson the hard way. Other cities with large refugee populations are now confronting similar risks. Whether those risks become tomorrow's headlines it depends entirely on whether policymakers choose accountability over the denials that they've been carrying around. Fraud is not inevitable, but pretending culture, incentives, and enforcement don't matter, that ensures that we will never, ever, ever succeed. It continues to fail, and that failure will continue forever. And fraud would be inevitable if this is the case. This is something that should be, making every voter pause. Not pause because of what's been proven in court, but because of what the timing tells us. In 2024, the Democratic Party elevated Minnesota Governor Tim Walz to the national stage as vice presidential contender. That move wasn't accidental. It was a signal. Party leadership was telling the whole entire country that this is what competent, progressive governance looks like. Fast forward to now, about a year later. Minnesota is suddenly the center of some of the largest public funds fraud scandals in the country. Billions of dollars exposed. Emergency programs have been exploited all over Minnesota. Documented warnings were ignored. Oversight failures that didn't come from nowhere, but from agencies operating under Walz administration. Let's be clear now. Tim Walz has not been charged with a crime for now. No one is claiming he personally committed a fraud. That's not the point, though. Politics isn't just about criminal guilt. It's about judgment, management, and that old word responsibility. And here's where the problem starts, guys. Multiple agencies under his watch received early warnings. Auditors raised concerns. Red flags were visible. Yet money kept flowing. Oversight lagged. Intervention came late. After the damage was done, that's not a legal argument. That's a leadership question. So voters are left asking something reasonable at this point. How does a party present someone as vice presidential material only to have massive oversight failures surface almost immediately afterwards? Do Democrats really have this bad of a character intuition, or is this all on purpose? Democrats say it was bad actors exploiting pandemic programs. That's probably true, but incomplete. Bad actors exist everywhere. The real test of leadership is whether systems catch them early or enable them to quietly operate for years. And that's the optics that are, unavoidable in this situation. Walz was promoted as so-called proof that bigger government can be run responsibly. Minnesota became evidence of what happens when spending expands faster than enforcement and when political sensitivity makes leaders hesitant to shut things down over re-election campaigns. Is it a coincidence? Maybe, but in politics, coincidence doesn't erase responsibility, and we all know it doesn't happen very often. Does this look like a coincidence to you from the outside? At minimum, it raises questions about how seriously the Democrat Party vets executive competence before elevating leaders nationally. At worst, it suggests a pattern: promotion first, accountability later, narrative before the audit, and us before them mentality. This is about systems. It's not about incentives. It's about whether voters are supposed to ignore what happens on the ground once the campaign slogans fade. Because when leadership works, fraud gets stopped early. When it doesn't, taxpayers find out later, after paying the bill. And that's why this question isn't going away. Not because of accusations, but because of timing, scale, and what leadership actually means when the money starts moving around. That leads us to the question, a lot of taxpayers are asking out loud now, and sometimes quietly, but mostly angry, guys. Are Democrats out to take the taxpayers' money for themselves? The honest answer is yes, in my opinion. A coordinated plot by the Democratic Party to personally steal public funds has been underway for decades. And that matters, and it should be said clearly. But here's the harder truth that follows right behind it, guys. What we do see over and over is a governing model that moves enormous sums of taxpayer money quickly. It relies heavily on politician-owned nonprofit intermediaries and reduces front-end oversight, then reacts after abuse is exposed. In that environment, money doesn't need to be taken for themselves in a direct way for the system to fail taxpayers. They don't need to be putting it, directly in their pocket for it to fail us. It's failing us en masse already. The pattern looks like this. Expand programs fast, trust, grantees by default, avoid aggressive scrutiny to prevent political backlash and so you can be reelected, and then promise to clean it up later if anybody notices. When fraud happens, leaders distance themselves and then they point to the bad actors. It's technically true, but it's always incomplete. Who are the bad actors and who enabled them? The enablers should be held accountable as well in this day and age in America, because taxpayers aren't just paying for stolen dollars. They're paying for negligence, poor controls, late enforcement, and political hesitation so that people can be put back in office, so that they can pander to a base of people. They're breaking the law, literally. They're paying when oversight is treated as optional and audits come after the money is gone. The taxpayers are always paying. And there's another uncomfortable reality. It's even when politicians don't pocket a dime, power, influence, or loyalty flow with money, big programs build constituencies. Their funding builds networks. Networks build political protection, and that doesn't require criminal intent. It requires incentives that reward expansion more than accountability. So the real question isn't whether Democrats are stealing, it's whether their approach to governance specifically exposes taxpayer money to abuse while making it politically risky to stop the flow once, the problems appear. From my perspective, it's not an accident. It's the predictable result of prioritizing scale over safeguards and narrative over enforcement. It's that taxpayers don't expect perfection, but they do expect seriousness. They expect early intervention when warnings surface, and they expect leaders to shut programs down when fraud appears, even if it's politically uncomfortable for them. And when that happens, trust erodes. People stop asking whether money was taken intentionally and start asking whether anyone was even watching at all. That's the question Democrats haven't answered yet, and conservatives want to know. As we close tonight, guys, don't forget the timing, because politics is often judged less by court rulings and more by patterns. And I feel like I see a pattern here, don't you? Again, in 2024, Democrats elevated Tim Walz into the national stage as the vice presidential contender. That was symbolic. It was a signal that party leaders viewed him as a competent, trustworthy, and emblematic of how progressive governments is supposed to work. And the optics are hard to ignore. When a governor is promoted nationally and shortly afterward, his state is revealed to have overseen massive failures in safeguarding taxpayer money, conservatives are right to ask questions, not about criminal guilt, but about judgment, management, and priorities. Are Democrats purposefully elevating incompetence to drain taxpayer money during Democratic presidencies? Is there evidence of a coordinated plot? I think there is. I notice a repeated pattern. Rapid expansion of government programs, massive flows of public money, reduced front-end oversight, enforcement that comes only after the damage is done. In that environment, incompetence doesn't stop the system. It fuels it, guys. Oversight failed. Money didn't need to be stolen for themselves directly to be lost. It gets absorbed into nonprofits, contractors, networks, and bureaucracies that grow alongside political powers. The influence, it expands. Dependency upon that money, it grows. Accountability lags. Government swells. When leaders preside over these failures without consequences, when they're promoted rather than questioned, it sends a message. Not that fraud is acceptable, but that stopping fraud is optional. And as long as the political narrative holds and the taxpayers don't notice, right? As long as we aren't looking and we're not paying any attention, this is going to continue to go on. Hopefully, my fellow Americans, we wake up and we start looking around. And that's what troubles me. Not demographics, not legal immigration, not even taxes themselves, but the incentives. A system that rewards expansion over enforcement will keep producing the same results. When Democrats are in power and the party that elevates leaders without reckoning honestly in their records, it invites skepticism, not trust. It's not coincidence. It's definitely not at this point. It's a pattern, and it's increasingly harder to dismiss the signs. The lesson here isn't about one governor or one scandal. It's about whether voters are expected to ignore outcomes as long as their branding sounds right. Taxpayers we deserve better than that. We deserve leaders who stop fraud early, not explain it later. We deserve accountability before promotion, not exposure. And we deserve a political system that treats our money with seriousness. I demand it. That's the real issue. And unfortunately, it's not going away anytime soon, my friends. But that's all I got for you guys today. You've been listening to the New Conservative Radio Show. I'm your host, NINJ. Please stop by 4547blog.com and get the new Blogazine Volume 2 or gear up with some new conservative apparel. But until next time, stay safe out there.